Hey everyone, this is Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of The Language of Leadership. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dirk Smillie. Dirk is the former Chief Content Officer at Guggenheim Partners and Senior Forbes reporter. He was a researcher at a media think tank at Columbia University, director of the News Research Group of New York, previously spent some time at the Christian Science Monitor. His first book was Falwell Inc., but I think tonight we're really going to be diving into The Business of Tomorrow, the visionary life of Harry Guggenheim. Dirk, it's great to be with you today.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I am delighted to be able to both learn a little bit more about you and the life of Harry Guggenheim as well. Before we jump into learning about Harry, the Guggenheim family, and how he took aviation and rocketry to a whole nother level in the United States, would it be possible just to learn a little bit more about you? When you were younger, when you were growing as a writer and a reporter, who are some of the influences on your life?
Well, that's a great question. I grew up in New York City and went to Catholic school until I was 8. My parents decided to move at that point to LA. They're both actors. And so it was better for them business-wise, but it was also better, I think, for myself and my sister to be in LA versus kind of downtown Manhattan at the time. And I grew up sort of gravitating toward journalism, but I also had some aspirations toward public policy. And so I kind of veered back and forth between these two worlds until I kind of settled on journalism and focused on that. Early on, I would say someone who I really respected a great deal was Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers, he's become this legend in broadcasting, but at the time he hosted a couple of different shows that kind of brought the two worlds of journalism and public policy together, which really, kind of greatly interested me. And he's just really like a thinking person's journalist, someone who would do deep dives into his interviews without lots of ideological baggage or predispositions about issues. He really just wanted to learn a lot on whatever subject matter he was dealing with. So I would say Bill Moyers was really one of the early idols that I had in the world of journalism.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Dirk. I think it's clear that even in the style of writing The Business of Tomorrow, you went deep into all the nooks and crannies of Harry's life or of Guggenheim's life. So it's clear that Moyer's detailed style definitely rubbed off on you quite a bit there.
It's true.
In the book that you write about, which I had the chance to pick up and read here on my Kindle. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the hard copy yet in China, but I hear that it's coming this way. Is that right?
This is true. Hopefully later this year, The Business of Tomorrow will be out in paperback and also in an ebook and an audio version as well.
Well, we'll be
So
looking forward to that here in China very soon. Tell
thank
us a
you.
little bit about your process for writing the book. You were at Guggenheim Partners working as Chief Content Officer. Maybe you can share with us a little bit about what is Guggenheim Partners and how did you get started on this amazing project?
Well, Guggenheim Partners is a global financial services firm. They have a large kind of asset management business. They also have a securities business. They're not that old. They've only been around for, let's see, close to 30 years. But they were started by one of the members of the Guggenheim family, Peter Lawson Johnson II. And I make the case in the book that Guggenheim Partners is kind of an extension of Harry's legacy. Guggenheim Partners started maybe 50 years after Harry passed away, but the values and I think the some of the operational philosophies that Harry instilled into the museum translated very well into a financial services firm, which might sound odd on its face, but when you think about who do you trust to manage your money. You want someone who is, a trusted advisor, someone with integrity, hopefully a certain level of cultural competence. And these are a lot of the qualities that I think that Harry helped to advance at the museum. And years later, when it came time to start Guggenheim Partners, I think that all those kind of associations that people had with the museum translated well into the financial services firm. So that's kind of a short answer, I guess, of the sort of the connection between the Guggenheim brand and Guggenheim Partners. But the book that I wrote, which is the that you referenced, the biography of Harry Guggenheim, that grew out of a project at Guggenheim Partners. I would get calls from people. I was a chief content officer at the time, and I would get calls from like a fund manager or somebody who's cultivating business for Guggenheim overseas, and they would say, what kind of information do you have on the family's contributions to aviation or rocketry or, all these different business ventures that the Guggenheims had been involved with over the years. And I always had to say, nothing. I don't have anything. And so I started to just do these kind of mini profiles about businesses that the Guggenheims had been in the past. And the name that kept coming up over and over again was Harry Guggenheim. And at one point, I asked my friend Peter Lawson Johnson, who co-founded Guggenheim Partners, I said, he would be an amazing focus of a book, of a business biography. And I was astounded that no one had ever done one on him up at that point. So anyway, make a long story short, I left Guggenheim to do the book. The book took a little longer than I would have liked it to, but we finally got it done. And I am I'm proud to have been able to be the first person to do a bio on Harry, who I think, to my way of thinking, has got one of the best. It's one of the best business backstories of the 20th century in terms of American business. And he's really like one of these hidden figures that had so much to do with not just the birth of aviation and the development of the rocket age in the U.S., but also lots of other ventures that I go into in the book.
Well, that tees up the book itself perfectly, Dirk. To understand Harry, I think it is important to understand what the legacy he was born into. And then, of course, later on, we can discuss the legacy that he created for the family. But how did the Guggenheims arrive at becoming wealthy and influential? And what would have Harry's childhood have been like? You paint such a vivid picture in the opening chapters of the book. I think it would be great to give our listeners just a quick sneak peek into that.
Yeah, well, the Guggenheims emigrated from Switzerland around the middle of the 19th century, and they got involved in a lot of very modest ventures involving things like stove polish and embroidery and all these kind of like obscure things that were very much like fundamentally important things in households at that time. And then at one point, the family patriarch Meyer Guggenheim invested in a couple of silver mines out in Leadville, Colorado. Got very lucky with his choices and his investments, and so the family mining business was born around that time. And over the decades, Meyer was very smart about kind of reinvesting, expanding his mining empire into a pretty good sized business until around the turn of the century, when through a kind of a series of interesting financial machinations, the Guggenheims essentially took over the largest mining conglomerate on Earth at the time, which is called ASARCO, and running ASARCO made them the operators of the biggest collection of mines and smelters in the world, and that's what really led to their wealth. Harry was born in 1890, so he grew up at a time when the family wealth was just exploding. And he would have these summers in a town called Elberon, which is on the New Jersey coast. And each one of the Guggenheim brothers, there were 7 of them in the family partnership, each brother was enjoying so much wealth that they would build these massive kind of summer residences and each sort of trying to outdo the other. Some of them would run to over 100 rooms. And so this is the kind of rarefied upbringing that Harry had at that time. He was very interested in cars and motorcycles, and so he got some early knowledge of the workings of the internal combustion engine, and he was both an erudite young kid, but also had a great kind of knack for kind of like disassembling engines and being able to put them
Mhm.
together again. So he had kind of both sides of his brain worked in that direction, and I think that kind of gave him a good facility for understanding the early engineering of the aviation age, such as it was, which is what his family eventually turned a lot of their wealth toward, investing both in aviation and then rocketry with Robert Goddard, who
Mhm.
was a kind of this lone wolf scientist developing early prototypical rockets around the time that the Guggenheims got interested in his work. But Harry had an unusual upbringing in some respects, given the staggering amounts of wealth that were being developed around that time. His father Daniel appeared on the one of the earliest versions of the Forbes rich list, and he was I think he was number 13 in the entire country. So, the Guggenheims were right up there with the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts. And that, of course, was true up until the Depression hit. When the Depression hit, it hit the Guggenheim mining stocks pretty hard. And so there was a significant wipeout of the Guggenheim family wealth. But even so, it left an awful lot after Harry's father died in 1930, which is when Harry took over as the next family patriarch. So, for someone who enjoyed so much wealth growing up, it's interesting to see him begin to lead a life, which I kind of try to outline in the book, of not so much someone who was continuing to create the family wealth, but rather making the family known more for spending money than really making it.
Mm.
And that's when I think the Guggenheim brand really began to change from this kind of famous mining family into, some other things at the time that, businesses that they had never been involved with before.
There are a lot of things there I wanna pull on. Definitely want to jump into him working with Robert Goddard, and certainly I'd like to move and sort of end towards the family brand and redefine family legacy.
Mm.
But first, just on his education and childhood, I couldn't help but notice. And by the way, I think I chuckled out loud in the book that you refer to all the boys' houses as cottages, the hundreds of rooms in their cottages on the New Jersey coast. I think I put the book down there for a second and stared out the window. But but Harry was the president
Yeah.
of his high school's literary and debating society. He then went abroad to Cambridge, if I remember correctly, where he was studying and had the chance to meet amazing people there, and even be tutored by John Maynard Keynes, who would later redefine the world's economic paradigms as we know it, supply side economics and animal spirits and such. If you could just briefly talk about a little bit more in depth Harry's educational upbringing and kind of what he was like as a student, because I think for some of the
Mhm.
listeners who are students, it might be interesting to know just a little bit about that background.
Yeah. Well, I have a chapter on Harry's years at Cambridge. He was there for 3 years. And prior to that, he had done an apprenticeship down in Aguascalientes in Mexico. And I can imagine what kind of culture clash that was, going from literally, riding in a mule train on his way out, hundreds of miles into the Mexican desert to visit various Guggenheim mines, and then, sorting ores by hand. He got a good education in mining through that kind of family apprenticeship. But when he got back, he had actually served. He had done one term at Yale, and then dropped out to do the apprenticeship in the family mining business, and then he went to Cambridge after that, as you reference. And Harry had gotten married at that point, And it was an unusual arrangement at Cambridge because he, of course, was not in the communal. He was not in the any kind of dormitory. His father had arranged to for him and his wife Helen to live at a house which was so large. The property was so great that it was actually a little bit bigger than the entire college campus itself. He was at Pembroke College, one of the 30 constituent colleges at Cambridge. So he was in this giant house that had its own tennis courts. He spent a lot of time on the tennis courts, became very good, and actually wound up going to Wimbledon with the doubles partner that he had at the time. But he absolutely loved English culture and the sort of the intellectual life at Cambridge at the time. And he wasn't involved in any of the secret societies, as far as we can tell. But he really kind of became an overnight Anglophile, and all of the rituals at Cambridge. From the dining hall rituals on up to very graduation day, when your entire ceremony is conducted in Latin, everything about Cambridge he loved. And I think it really kind of connected him to English culture in a way that stayed with him for the rest of his life. But Keynes tutored his students at the time, which was actually pretty lucrative for him. I looked at some of Keynes's private appointment books when I was doing research there, and he really made a pretty good amount of money tutoring students on the side. He didn't like doing it because he had so many other things that were, sort of placing demands on him at the
Mm-hmm.
time. He was already a pretty famous economist. And but he did tutor these young men, and as Harry has been, was a lifelong budget hawk and a conservative, to say the least, in his view of economics. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure that much of John Maynard Keynes's philosophy rubbed off on him, but they seem to have a good relationship for the time that Harry was there.
So Harry was born into privilege, unquestionably, and many people who were or who are don't always pursue that to positive ends, or don't always step up into the mantle of what might be expected of them. But Harry returns to the US and becomes really the chief of the family business, and then over time he becomes known as the godfather of aviation. He funds some work at Caltech. He funds famously Robert Goddard. The dean of the Harvard Business School claims that Harry Guggenheim had a greater impact on the advancement of aviation than the Wright brothers themselves. I mean, this is quite an achievement. Can you share with us a little bit
Yeah.
about this? How did Harry become the godfather of aviation?
Well, that is a great question. When Harry came back from Cambridge, he did another. Well, I wouldn't really call it an apprenticeship. He had a sort of basically a job assignment for another family mine down in Chile. He and the that experience went well, but a short time after that, the family decided to sell that mine. And Harry had put a lot of sweat equity into it. He actually built the mining town that was used to house the workers. I mean, we're talking about a town down in the northern deserts of Chile of maybe 10,000 people. And so that was his first big achievement in life. And then a matter of a year or two later, the brothers decided to sell that mine. And Harry and his cousin Edmund, who were both board members at that time, profoundly disagreed with that decision, and they really considered it to be a sabotage of their future with the firm, because it was like the jewel in the crown of the Guggenheim mining properties. So Harry had a big falling out with his uncles and with his father, and he quit Guggenheim Brothers, and he then spent a lot of time with a new plane that he had bought, flying around Long Island, meeting other pilots. And, if you're flying around Long Island at that point in history, mid 20s, there are no airports, and there certainly is no weather service telling you what to expect later in the afternoon or anything like that. So I think he got a real bird's eye view of how lagging the United States was at that time in terms of any kind of infrastructure
Hmm.
for aviation compared to Europe, that had planes flying all over the place and a large passenger service business that was developing. And I think Harry was trying to figure out how could the U.S., which essentially created the airplane, how could the United States be so far behind the rest of, or the rest of Europe? So he and his father created an aviation fund with the help of a number of people in the administration at the time. This was when Calvin Coolidge was president, and then uh, they became Harry and his father became great friends with Hoover. When Hoover came in, they had a lot of collaboration with the federal government at that time in terms of rolling out different types of aviation ventures and helping to establish R&D programs, research facilities, graduate programs in aviation. They kind of spread out in so many ways, different types of ventures that would essentially underpin the infrastructure of aviation, such as it was at the time. The engineering school started to graduate Guggenheim aviation engineers in a very short time. And maybe over the next 15, 20 years, most of the senior engineers at aviation companies had been graduates of Guggenheim schools. So they made this big push into aviation. And Harry at that time had become great friends with Charles Lindbergh. Um, and Lindbergh and Harry both were sort of looking for the next step, the next sort of upward extension of aviation, like what comes after this in terms of research and development. And rocketry was the obvious answer, but they hadn't found anyone or any real institution to invest in because, again, it was such a nascent it wasn't even a sector of business at that time. It was basically just a lot of experimentation going on. So through Lindbergh's help, Harry identified Robert Goddard as probably the best bet in terms of an individual scientist doing research in rocketry. And Harry basically bankrolled most of Goddard's research over a period of about 10 years. And so that was kind of like the next big step in terms of family contribution to aviation and electronics. But the reason that Harry is being credited now with advancing aviation and on par with the Wright brothers is just because of all the money that he poured into the very infrastructure of aviation at a time when really no one else was investing in it. So even though the Wright brothers invented the airplane, they then went on to protect their patents and their designs, which had the effect of slowing down the rollout of aviation. And Harry really was kind of trying to do just the opposite. He was very much an open source, open hardware kind of guy, so that's why he's being credited with the contributions toward aviation that he's now becoming known for.
And with those contributions, I also know that there was maybe a little bit of a little bit of conflict, right? I mean, Harry wasn't always this magnanimous Santa Claus like figure who's simply writing checks to everybody. Lindbergh, as you mentioned, his friend said, and I quote, "He was an extraordinary and wonderful man among my closest friends." Frank Lloyd Wright takes a little bit more of a hard approach, the famous architect saying, Harry doesn't like controversy, he likes to win. Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, says, the man who alternately charmed and intimidated us, and Thomas Messer, the third director of the Guggenheim Museum, puts it bluntly, he says, a tyrant. So, what was Harry's leadership style?
Well, in the words of Richard Armstrong, who's the current director of the museum, he referred to Harry as a guy who was all about clarity and execution. And that's all he cared about. He did not really mind butting heads with people. Um, it's an interesting topic, the construction of the Guggenheim Museum, because Harry really didn't know much about art at the time that he took over that job. But there was a lot of controversy going on in the early stages of the museum before it was even constructed at the site that we know it at today.
Mhm.
It was housed at another location, and this was essentially Solomon Guggenheim's art collection, Harry's uncle. Um, so these are, in different situations with regard to the museum. I think whenever Harry felt that his uncle's vision was being challenged, he didn't suffer fools gladly, as they say. So he had a lot of run-ins with Sweeney, who you mentioned, who's the second director of the museum. Um, Frank Lloyd Wright was someone who was known as a control freak who wanted to make decisions about everything, starting with the architecture, but then also going into things like the interior colors of the museum, how the paintings would be fixed in space, the types of lighting that would be used for the paintings, and so Harry was kind of between a rock and a hard place in a sense because you had Frank Lloyd Wright, who was even then was clearly the most famous architect in America and was not used to having his work being questioned, but Harry was trying to basically referee these two very strong personalities, Frank Lloyd Wright and then James Sweeney, who was the director of the museum and had his own very fixed ideas about how art should be displayed and presented, and how the museum, what the museum should look like on the interior, which he felt was his domain, and I think rightly so. So Harry had to basically manage these two big egos, and I think if you read that chapter in my book, you probably will get the sense that it was really Frank Lloyd Wright who was kind of stepping over the line, perhaps more than Sweeney. And so Harry had a lot of run-ins with Wright, but in the end, he kept him on board. He stopped him from resigning, and he kept Sweeney from resigning. And I think in the end, most of the family members were very happy with the way the museum turned out, but it took a lot of negotiating skills and managing big egos to get it done.
And then ultimately, Harry's legacy was moving the Guggenheim name forward. At the turn of the century, as you write, the Guggenheims operated the largest mining conglomerate on Earth. 6 decades later, the Guggenheim Museum opened, creating a landmark in New York and recasting the family as stewards of a global art brand. Harry carried the torch between the old and new eras, connecting them with a record of aggressive philanthropy and entrepreneurship. I feel like this section of the book just so neatly encapsulates the challenge that he was able to overcome, moving from inherited wealth from first to second or even third generation. Harry chose a different path, as you write, and really made the family a very positive contributor to the community. Could you speak on this for a moment and what a unique set of characteristics Harry exemplified in this transition for the family?
Mm. Yeah, I it's a very interesting transition to watch the Guggenheim brand evolve over the 20th century, because as you say, Mike, they were known in the mining business. They were the last word in the mining business. A lot of people considered the Guggenheims as the family that really made mining an investment on Wall Street in the first place. But that period ended in the 30s, uh, beginning with death of Harry's father, and then Harry kind of taking over the family business, so to speak. I think when the aviation fund was established in the late 1920s, Harry was known as you mentioned, the godfather of flight, because nobody was putting as much money into aviation on a private sector basis as the Guggenheims. So overnight, they kind of became known as patrons of aviation, and then patrons of rocketry. And so that's kind of where the brand stood through most of the middle part of the 20th century. Um, but when the Guggenheim was built, and sort of the impact on the modern art scene around the world that it had, I think that was a second transformation of the Guggenheim brand. And at that point, most people who still knew about aviation, rocketry, and also all the other things that Guggenheim's invested in around that time. Harry co-founded a newspaper out on Long Island called Newsday, became the most successful suburban paper in the U.S. For a time. And then he also created a horse racing stables that became the highest earning stables in the late 1950s. He went to the Kentucky Derby 5 times. So you have these other things that were kind of high impact businesses, but didn't really transform the brand, which I think you're referring to. So it was very interesting that the visibility of the Guggenheim Museum really transformed the Guggenheim brand. And then several decades later, the birth of the Wall Street company, Guggenheim Partners, I think very much drew on the largely positive attributes of that brand,
Mhm.
and it was an interesting sort of migration of a museum brand into a Wall Street company. I'm not sure I've ever seen that occur before, but it has certainly worked well for them. And Guggenheim Partners, I think right now is managing somewhere close to 300 million I'm sorry, 300 billion in assets, which is pretty good. It's a sort of a large boutique Wall Street firm, I guess you might call it. But anyway, Harry is very much the guy who transformed the brand in the 20th century, whether he really fully intended to or not. I don't think he ever considered the museum as a branding exercise per se. But a very short time after the museum opened, you had people like the Prime Minister of India and the Shah of Iran, and you had all these foreign leaders who were like fascinated with this crazy looking museum that was getting so much attention and changing some of our sensibilities about art and how art should be displayed, and kind of turn museums themselves into works of art and create stars out of a lot of these museum architects who in the past had kind of toiled in obscurity. So I mean, we know the name Frank Gehry, Frank Lloyd Wright. That has a lot to do with some of the architectural creations that they have made in the arts.
Harry was really able to make that transition and really catapult the family's name. It sounds like from one of pure financial and business focus to one of being a patron of the arts, and now the name Guggenheim you certainly associate with Guggenheim Partners. But I think when most people hear the name Guggenheim, they immediately think of this beautiful, iconic museum and art collection.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really kind of, I think the museum created the kind of a global art brand overnight, because some years later, of course, you had the Guggenheim Bilbao open in Spain, which helped to kind of redevelop a sort of an old sleepy port town into a real destination because you got this famous museum there. And then you've got one in Abu Dhabi that's being developed. I think that's going to open sometime in the next 3 or 4 years. And you had a lot of sort of other kind of brand extensions off of the museum itself that have worked pretty well for the Guggenheim family. So it's interesting to. I mean, it was fascinating to me to do the chapter on the Guggenheim Museum because I had no idea uh, of the controversy and the fact that at one point the New York Times, because of its concerns for how the direction of the museum was going, they actually asked that the actually Guggenheim family to turn over the entire art collection to another museum that could better manage it, say like the Whitney or the Met. And I think at that point Harry had just taken over the construction of the museum, and I think he realized that this was like a really serious public relations crisis, and he did pretty well in turning that around and getting the various critics back on the side of the family as the museum project went forward. But the Guggenheim Museum that we know today may very well not have existed without Harry's machinations to make it possible in the first place.
Well, Dirk, we really appreciate you joining us today. I know that you have so much more detail to dive into, and I really cannot encourage people more to buy the book. It's certainly an incredibly meticulously researched and well written and page turning one. I found myself really going through not only chapter to chapter, but sections within the chapters very quickly. The book is The
Mm.
Business of Tomorrow, The Visionary Life of Harry Guggenheim. And Dirk, where can we go to find out more information about your work and pick up the book ourselves?
Well, Mike, probably the quickest, easiest way is just to go to Amazon and look up Harry Guggenheim. But the Pegasus publishing page, Pegasus is my publisher. They have a lot more background in terms of reviews and comments and things like that. So that'd be a second location.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure that we
Yeah.
link to that in the notes that we share with all of our listeners so that they can get their hands on a
Okay.
copy of the book. And we look forward to also seeing the Chinese language version soon later this year, we hope.
I'll be sending you the Mandarin version as soon as it comes out.
Looking forward. Well, thank you so much for
Okay.
your time, Dirk. Really appreciate it.
Honor to be with you, Mike. Thanks very much.
Thanks.